Okay, well, my name is Shelley Lewis, and I am president of the League of Women Voters of Geauga. And on behalf of our board and of our members, who are well represented here, we want to welcome all of you to this event. One of the best parts of my job is getting to Thanksgiving. This event doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are a lot of people involved. So first, I want to thank Munson Township for this wonderful space. And he's hiding behind me, but if you all wanted to personally thank Munson Township trustee Andy Bushman, he's hiding back here.
Thank you, Mr. Bushman.
Thank you so much. We want to thank Fireside Books for providing the books for us locally. If you're not familiar with this wonderful local independent bookshop that's located in Chagrin Falls, I encourage you to visit. We want to thank Trifles Catering for providing your lunch. And my last shout out is to Lori O'Neill, who is seated at the front here. Lori had the audacity to say, "Why not Geauga?" So we are just so thankful to Lori's efforts to bring Bartlett McQuade here. So thank you, Lori. So that you're all aware, the program is being recorded for later rebroadcast on our YouTube channel. So a little bit about our league. Our mission is to empower voters and defend democracy. And educating voters is the key to fulfilling that mission. So historically, our efforts have focused in two areas: elections and local government. And those of you who are in Geauga are probably familiar with our candidate forums, our voter guides, and then in the government area, our observer reports. We send trained observers out to county and most school board meetings. We write up reports. Those reports are all available on our website. So if you're not currently following our observer reports, I urge you to do so. It's a great way to stay informed about what's going on in the county. Visit our website. You can sign up for the email, and we'll send you a monthly email. It probably goes out the early part of the next month, but it will come to your email. You can read it at your leisure, or you can just go to our website and read them as they pop up. So I encourage all of you to do that. This is the first time that we have done educational work on issues, and so I'm really excited by this opportunity. We are just the first of many more to come. I know Lori's got a bunch of ideas percolating. Other league members have programs that they're recommending. I want you to understand that it's made possible by a financial contribution from a member of the community. So if you'd like to help us bring more programming like this to Geauga, we ask that you consider a financial contribution. Folks out as you're exiting can help you with that. The program itself, we envision this as a moderated discussion. And when trying to come up with the right person who could sit side by side with Barbie McQuade and speak on the issue of disinformation, the person who just immediately jumped to mind was Jen Miller, our executive director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio. So it's going to be formatted as a discussion between these two very well-versed individuals. It'll be followed by audience Q&A. It'll be set up here again. You can come and ask your questions. And then it will be followed by a book signing at the end. So that's how the program's going to lay out. Let me just give brief introductions here. I think most of you know who these ladies are. On your right, Jen Miller, Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio. And of course, on your left, Barbara McQuade, holding new legislator. No, I'm messing with my schedule here. Former U.S. Attorney, law profession, television legal analyst, and now best-selling author. So, Geauga, please give another warm welcome to our esteemed guest.
I just want to thank you all for coming and thank everyone who made this possible. I want to remind everyone that this was completely organized by the volunteers of the Geauga Week. And that's an incredibly important thing to remember. Yes, I am paid, a staff person, but most of the work we do is by volunteers because we care so much about democracy and voting. Before we get started, I wanted to just mention a few things about the League, which is that informed voters is in our mission. And when we were founded in 1920 from the Ohio Woman Suffrage Association, we recognized that we were going to have a whole new group of voters that had never voted before. And quite frankly, the gentlemen in their households might not have even supported their right to vote. So we were trying for a long time to get that right to vote. So it was really about women teaching women at that point, you know, the logistics, how to vote, where to vote, when to vote. But things like the candidate guide that we're known for nationally actually started in the 1920s out of Cleveland. Our nonpartisan status that we so fiercely defend and protect was actually insisted on by Bell Sherwin, who was the second president of LWVG from Cleveland. And our long history here in Ohio is one that a lot of the ways that elections work are things that we championed. The bipartisan control of local boards of elections, the rules for runoffs, the fact that machines need one Republican key and one Democrat key to get into, all of the testing and certification of machines. Not only did we insist on that happening, we go, and it's kind of boring, but because parts of democracy are actually supposed to be boring, right? The post-certification processes, post-election audits, these are all things that the League has championed. So sometimes people think that because we do fight so hard for access to the ballot and making sure that people with disabilities and students and everyone can overcome those barriers, and those barriers are not too significant. But as important to us is election security and election integrity. And part of that for the last several years has been making sure that Ohioans have a better understanding as to all the safeguards that we have around our elections. And so I'm really pleased to be here with all of you to talk about this issue of disinformation and how that is polluting our political environment and polluting our elections. And I'm really pleased to have Barbara here because she doesn't know that I've often wanted to know what she thought about national cases and things, because I'm not a lawyer. People think I am. I'm not one. I just translate complicated legal stuff sometimes. So I just wanted to say that this is in the heart of the mission here, that you couldn't have a more Ohio League of Women Voters thing than to have it be volunteer run and to be about making sure that we as Ohioans better understand the issues that are impacting our community and could be impacting our understanding of politics and how elections work. And so with that, I would love to just start and ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself and why that prompted you to write this book.
Well, thank you, Jen, and thank you all so much for inviting me to be here today. It's really a great honor. I am a great admirer of the League of Women Voters, providing nonpartisan, accurate information for people so that they can exercise their right to vote in an informed way. What a great mission that is. So it's really a great honor for me to be with all of you here today. So thank you for the invitation. A little about me. I'm from Michigan, or as I know you folks sometimes refer to as that place up north. Sorry. we're all Midwesterners, right? But most of my career I spent as a national security prosecutor. And during that time, I saw the threats to our national security evolve from Al-Qaeda to ISIS to Russia and China to hacking through cyber intrusions. And now I teach a course on national security law at the University of Michigan Law School. And since about 2018, one of the topics that I have taught in that class is disinformation, originally coming from Russia. And I assigned to them to read Robert Mueller's report on the 2016 election interference with Russia. I know when people think of the Mueller report, they often think mostly about what he did or did not find about Donald Trump. But aside from all of that, he also found some very interesting things about Russia's efforts to sow discord in society, to make us mad at each other, and it has largely worked. But now I see that we have people who have learned those tactics from Russian operatives, and people are using it to advance their own political agendas within the United States, whether that agenda is for politics or profit or one's own career. It is just as damaging to society when that attack comes from within than from when it comes from a hostile foreign adversary. So I wrote this book in an effort to explain to ordinary people what I am seeing so that people can identify these tactics, recognize them when they see them, to avoid being manipulated by them.
Thank you. Can you define for us disinformation, and can you give us a couple examples, maybe one that is targeting different populations, maybe someone who leans a little bit more to the right and maybe a voter who leans a little bit more to the left, just so that we understand that it can impact all of us?
Yeah, well, you know, in my book, I actually distinguish between the terms disinformation and misinformation. And some people use those terms interchangeably, and that's fine. But I wanted to name them separately because I wanted to treat them differently. So disinformation, in my view, is the deliberate use of lies or deception or misleading language to manipulate people. Misinformation is kind of its unwitting cousin, where we read something or believe it, or because we hear it so many other times, we begin to believe it's true. And in that way, we become spreaders of misinformation. I will even confess to you about a time when I myself was a spreader of misinformation. I'm not proud of it, but I will confess it to you because I think it illustrates how this can work. So I read a post online that said that Patrick Mahomes, the star quarterback in the NFL, had said that he was refusing to play another down until the Kansas City Chiefs changed their name to something that was not offensive to Native Americans. And I saw that and thought, wow, that's really interesting. Someone who is putting their money where their mouth is. I mean, he makes, scores of millions of dollars a year. So I retweeted that out right away. And then later that day, I was talking to my husband and my son and said, did you see that story about Patrick Mahomes? And they said, no, what story? And I said, oh, come on, you must have seen it. It's got to be big news. It must be everywhere about, not playing another down. And they said, no, I haven't seen anything about it. Like, well, it's got to be true because I read it on Twitter. And so I went back and said, no, it looked really legit. So I went back and I found it. I said, look, there it is. It's from an ESPN account. That's a credible source. But then I looked a little bit closer and I saw that it said ESPN Sports Center. Not Sports Center, but misspelled Sprott Center. So it was a fake designed to look really good and really legit. And I thought about why that worked, right? It took an issue that's very divisive in American society, right? The renaming of teams. Is that respectful to Native Americans, or is it woke culture? And it's something that people would get excited about on both sides of the issue and would be ramping up and spreading around. And so I fell prey to that. So it's a great example, I think, of how these disinformation campaigns work simply to sow division in society. So some examples. I think one example that we're hearing quite a bit these days is when Donald Trump refers to the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, have been charged with crimes and have been sentenced to prison for things like assaulting police officers, refers to them as hostages. Right, that suggests that they are somehow political prisoners, and we hear others repeating those claims. Elise Stefanik, Congresswoman in New York, repeats that phrase. Marjorie Taylor Greene in Georgia repeats that phrase. I think that is an example of disinformation. Another example, maybe coming from what appears to be the left, is one where it's described in the Mueller report. There were these these political operatives who were, Russian intelligence officers who developed these online personas. Remember, Vladimir Putin, grew up in the KGB. He knows the tradecraft. And so in 2016, well before the election, many, many months before, there were people who created accounts on social media, and they had names like Blacktivist or United Muslims of America, Tennessee GOP, Heart of Texas. They posed as people on all sides of the political spectrum, but one that was, targeting the left, in this case in particular, was one called Blacktivist, who had cultivated hundreds of thousands of followers for many months leading up to the election, and then on the eve of the election said things like, Hillary Clinton has never done anything for our community. We should send her a message by staying home on election day, and let her know we will not be taken for granted. Well, if even only a few people believe that to be true and stayed home from the polls on election day, that could have made a difference in the outcome of the election. So, it gets used against the right, against the left, and it is, disinformation is a nonpartisan weapon.
So you say in your book that we live in a post-truth world. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I say not only do we live in a post-truth world, we live in a post-shame world. And I think, and what I mean by that is that there are some who are genuinely fooled by disinformation. I was genuinely fooled by this claim about Patrick Mahomes. And I think there are people who are genuinely fooled that the 2020 election was stolen and other kinds of claims. But I also think there is a significant number of people who are not fooled. They just don't care, because they have instead decided that what matters most is that their side wins. As long as my side wins, I don't really care what they say, what they do. Donald Trump is fond of saying, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose any voters. I think it's because he correctly understands that in these polarizing times, people care more about their political tribe than they care about any single issue. And that, I think, is a very dangerous thing, right? I remember when I was in college, first kind of forming my own views on various issues, it was not uncommon for me or my friends to have views all across the political spectrum. I might think one thing about abortion rights. I might think another about guns. I might think one thing about tax policy. I might think another about affirmative action, another about immigration, right? I was thinking about these issues independently on my own. I gathered facts and information and formed an opinion. Today, when I see students, they are lined up in lockstep with whatever is the party line. It's almost as if they reverse engineer their own viewpoint. Where does my party stand on all those issues I just named? That so do I. And in fact, to let on that you disagree about this issue might suggest that you are somehow not part of the tribe, that you are not faithful, and you might get excommunicated from your tribe. I've been having conversations recently with people about what's going on college campuses. I think peaceful protest to share your viewpoint is absolutely 100% an American right and a bedrock right in American society. But regardless of what your message is, I don't care what your content is, once you begin harming other people, engaging in violence, property damage, like it's time for the police to come and send you home or arrest you. And I don't care what your topic is. And yet I find some people have a hard time separating a cause from the conduct. And I think it's really important that we do that. But I also think that people fear that if I speak out and say this conduct is reprehensible, they will be labeled as supporting or opposing a particular message. And so I think we have to get away from that idea that our tribes matter more than our views on different issues. I mean, the League of Women Voters is all about giving you information so that you can form your own opinions. But I think the reason I say we're living in this post-truth and post-shame world is because people like Elise Stefanik are willing to stand up and call people hostages when she most certainly knows better. I fear that we are living in times when people are willing to choose tribe over truth.
So I think this is interesting because I think a lot of Ohioans consider themselves independent. In fact, I know that to be true, right? More people on the books are independent than Republican or Democrat. And I think about all of us that are kind of in the middle there and see these two tribes warring. You actually talk about how it's really easy to kind of get apathy or just like want to tune it all out. And you have a quote in here that you say, if we disengage from public discourse, we surrender a piece of our power to the disinformers. And I just wondered if you wanted to talk about that.
Yes, I think it's so important that we stay engaged. In fact, one of the things that's been very encouraging about doing book talks in a lot of different places is seeing how many people out there really are informed and engaged and want to participate in democracy. So that's been really encouraging to see that there are so many good people out there who want to do that. But one of the areas of research in my book is summarize some of the work done by a man named Peter Pomerantsev, who is a Russian researcher on Russian television and Russian media. And one of the things he talks about is how in Russia, it has been very much part of Putin's strategy to cause people to become exhausted by disinformation and conflicting claims so that people feel like they just can't keep up. One day he might tell the public that missiles were fired from Russia. The next day he might say those very same missiles were actually fired from Ukraine. And then the day after that, maybe he says those missiles came from NATO. And people say, well, which is it? And it's inconsistent, and it's deliberately inconsistent. It's designed to confuse you and exhaust you, and to create a belief that it's all spin, it's all PR, truth is for suckers. What is truth anyway? Is there any such thing as truth? Who knows what's true? And so what matters more isn't which candidate is telling you the truth, but which candidate will give you the greatest prosperity. And I can't keep up with it all anyway. Everybody's corrupt, and if everybody's corrupt, then I'm just going to tune out of politics. I'm going to disengage altogether. I'm cynical, I'm numb, and I'm just going to focus on the things I can control, like my job, my family, and that's all I'm going to do. And so when we do that, though, right, if we're supposed to be a government of, by, and for the people, then we are ceding our power to people who are willing to play these games. And I think we need to stand up to that by educating ourselves about issues and making sure we are exercising our power in an informed way.
So you also talk about how in the United States, especially, but all humans are prone to disinformation. But here in the United States, we're potentially a little bit more prone to disinformation. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's really an interesting irony, I think, that in a country where we have so much access to information, we can be fooled by disinformation. But I think there are some reasons for that. And one is our most cherished right, our right to free speech. We have the right to say an awful lot of things. Like, I don't know if you're following the trial of Donald Trump, but, it's not a crime to pay hush money. It's not a crime to lie in a political campaign. And all those things are true. And that's because we have a First Amendment that is very robust and really errs on the side of allowing us to say things because we don't want to squelch the public. We want to be able to speak out against our government. We have this actual malice standard when it comes to matters of public figures and public officials that tolerates even some errors as long as they're not deliberately made. But as a result of that, I think it can be very difficult to do some of the hard work about preventing disinformation. So social media, for example, lots of disinformation flying around in social media, but whenever there's any effort to try to introduce reasonable regulation about algorithms or collecting of private data or other things, you will hear people push back and say that's censorship. Because we all bristle at that term, right? I mean, if you're on the right or the left, censorship is a bad word, and we don't want to go down that road. But I submit to you that online is actually very different from the real world, and that we can engage in content-neutral regulations that would be nothing like censorship. But, whenever there is any suggestion, we'll hear people like Elon Musk go on Twitter and talk about things and say, social media platforms are the new town square. We can't stop people from saying things here because this is the modern day town square, in the same way we couldn't stifle what people were saying on soapboxes in the town square. Well, I submit to you that the town square is very different from social media, right? Because on the town square, you can see who's speaking. On social media, you can use an anonymous pseudonym. You could be Patriot Girl. You can be Blacktivist. One of my favorite New Yorker cartoons is that one where there's two dogs, one's on a computer and another sitting next to him, and he says, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. I mean, it's the same issue, right? It's the same thing is applying on these social, so you can't see who it is speaking. They call themselves Patriot Girl, but you don't know if it's an American patriot or someone sitting in a boiler room in Moscow. Also in the town square, you can tell how popular the speaker's message is. Are people cheering? Are people booing and cheering? Or are people ignoring the speaker altogether? Well, online, there are all these bots that are owned by the same user, right? These are AI-generated accounts that look like real accounts, and they're liking and sharing and spreading this message. And so it gets amplified, and it shows up in more feeds, and it looks like it's more popular than it really is. And so social media is not than in Town Square. It's different, and I think we need to think about it differently, because I think when we flood the zone with disinformation, we're making it harder for good information, accurate information, to find its way there. So I think there are things we can do about it. The classic example of Elon Musk, I think, utilizing social media in a way that is very different from the real world, is when he put to voters whether to restore the Twitter account of Donald Trump. And he said, I'm going to create a poll. Should we allow Donald Trump's account to be restored, yes or no? Put it out there. And now keep in mind, any one of us could have an infinite number of accounts on X, right? I could have hundreds of them if I wanted to. So he allows several days for voting. The voting occurs, the yeas have it, and he said, the people have spoken. Well, which people, right? I mean, in democracy, it's one person, one vote. Online, it's more like one person, 100,000 votes. So I think there's some differences there that ironically are allowing us to be exploited because of our fervent desire to protect our rights to free speech.
So another thing you say is conflict is good for the social media business.
Yes, so one of the things that we know from a whistleblower named Frances Haugen, she came in and testified before Congress. She had been a data scientist at Facebook, but was very disturbed by one of the things she observed, which was, in an effort to maximize profits, Facebook was driving to the top of our feeds content designed to generate outrage. It was the part of the business model that the more outraged we were by content, the more likely we were to engage with it. Send it to people. Can you believe this? This is awful. Did you see this then? Or even respond to it. This is awful. And because of that, the longer we're on the platform, the more we see the ads, and the more Facebook is able to charge the advertisers, and so they make more money as a result of that. So, the old phrase, the business of business is business, is true. And so they're going to do whatever it is that maximizes their profits, and that's their job. That's what they should do. Without any kind of regulation, I think we should expect that businesses are going to look out for their bottom line and their self-interest. But that's what happens. And so as a result, it's causing us to be polarized and to see things and to be shouting out at each other when we see these things online. And I think, again, we can have reasonable regulations that are content neutral, that go after the algorithms. I mean, this is just computer code that they have programmed, designed in such a way as to maximize outrage, or at the very least, to disclose the algorithms that they have programmed so that we can make reasonable and informed choices about whether we want to be on a platform that is manipulating us in this way.
And how about, we talk a lot about voters have the right to know, and we have a big dark money problem here in Ohio, where you just can't tell who's running an ad for a candidate or an issue or something. That's also true in social media. So can you talk about how hard it is to know who's behind an ad or who's behind a post and those kinds of things?
Yeah, I think there are two issues when it comes to campaign finance that are challenging. One is, the Supreme Court case called Citizens United that was decided in about 2010. And in that case, the court held that corporations, labor unions, and other organizations have First Amendment rights and cannot be limited in their expenditures on behalf of candidates. And so as a result, it really opened the floodgates to these super PACs, which is what is sometimes called dark money, because they're not required to disclose who their donors are. And so they might have a great name like the Red, White, and Blue Grandmothers of America. But in fact, it's like one guy with a lot of money or one industry that wants to promote whatever is their industry. We can't really see behind the curtain as to who's there. I don't think we're going to change Citizens United anytime soon. We've got, essentially the same majority on the Supreme Court that decided that case. But I do think we could change the law to require disclosure. So sure, you can spend whatever you want, but at least let's see who it is who's funding this. So if it really is the United Grandmothers of America, well, that's great, and good for you. But if it's instead one single donor or one single industry, then that could impact the way we view that cause and interpret that message. The other issue you mentioned in particular is on ads. On television ads and radio ads, you will hear a candidate must reveal that they're paying for it. So you'll see this ad was paid for by, I'm Joe Biden and I approved this ad, or whatever it is, whatever candidate. And that is required by for television and for radio. It is not required online. And so that's how you can have Russia, supporting a particular candidate, maybe a third-party candidate designed to siphon off votes from someone else, right? An ad promoting Jill Stein or Gary Johnson or one of these other people in an effort to take away votes from, some other candidate that they don't want to see get elected. And so online, again, I think this is a reasonable regulation, would not violate the First Amendment to require social media to just follow the same rules that we have for television and radio ads.
I'm just going to mention that in Citizens United, part of that, they talked about how transparency should be increased and how disclosure should be increased and how that sunshine could really help us. Ohio didn't change its campaign finance laws at all in that regard. So that's something that we will continue to work on at the League of Women Voters down at the State House on behalf of our members and all voters. Let's talk about how social media is, how disinformation is impacting our global standing in the world.
Yeah, so, as I mentioned, my background is in national security. And so I look at these problems from, how it affects us and our standing in the world and our ability to withstand threats from abroad. And I think there are a couple things worth mentioning here. So one is, why did Russia want to interfere in our election in 2016? I think a big part of it is if we're all mad at each other and we're fighting each other over guns and immigration and abortion and other kinds of things, then we're not paying attention to what's going on elsewhere in the world. It creates an opening for Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine or annex Crimea. It is his goal to reunite the former Soviet republics under the flag of Mother Russia. And so if we're all mad at each other over here, we don't have the bandwidth to pay attention to what's going on over there. And so I think that is part of what impacts our national security. And that does have an issue with our security. It has been the foreign policy of the United States since World War II to lift up democracies around the world on the theory that when other countries have democratic forms of government, there are likely to be fewer wars, there will be fewer refugee crises, and we will have better trade partners. Instead, we are seeing democratic backsliding in a number of countries around the world, and I think some of that is because of our own problems. After the January 6th attacks, when there were those horrible visuals of people, climbing the walls and climbing through windows, and in the Senate chamber, with their feet up on desks and other kinds of things, those images were beamed all over the world. And officials in Russia said, American democracy is limping on both feet. This is a great example of why democracy doesn't work. And instead, you should choose a form of government that's effective. When you have everybody trying to decide, people can't reach any sort of consensus, and you'll have war in the streets. And so, and all of that was driven by the disinformation that an election had been stolen or rigged. And there's just no evidence that that was true, right? Audits and lawsuits all determined that the election was accurate, and yet, through false claims, driving people to vigilante violence, resulted in this physical attack on the Capitol in an effort to use brute force to get the result they wanted.
Thank you. There's this normalization of violence that's happening. So can you talk about what that means to kind of normalize violence and how that's a tool maybe for those who are really trying to gain power?
Yes, I think it's a really dangerous place to be when you think about how members of school boards, health boards, election boards are getting threats and harassment. Many people, there's data of how many people are leaving those jobs or no longer seeking those jobs. Because you think about some of these jobs in local government, it's kind of thankless to begin with, right? It's hard work, it's low pay, if any pay, sometimes it's volunteer, and now you've got people screaming at you, whether it's, you're trying to turn our kids gay because you're allowing certain books in their library, you're trying to groom them for pedophilia because you won't ban these books, we're insisting that these books be banned, because there are people who are trying to sow dissent in society by pitting people against each other on the issue of gay rights, and that's how it manifests itself. But we are losing good people in government that we need to just, make things go. We need good people on school boards and on city councils, on election boards. But, if you're going to get a death threat, who needs it? We are seeing it at levels of, Secretary of State. We are seeing not only threats, But swatting, this idea where we call the police and say there's a barricaded gunman at this person's home address, and then they show up there and the person is, stunned to find this tanks rolling up their driveway. There was even one that led to a fatality in one of those swatting cases where someone, came outside and didn't know what was going on and got shot. So it's a very dangerous scenario. But I also worry that because we now have these threats, that it will have a chilling effect on our government. And so, we're seeing threats against judges, clerks, jurors, witnesses. There was even one juror in the Trump case who was seated in the box, and the next day came back and said, I don't think I can be fair because I'm afraid for my safety. Because of reporting, she had been outed, and some discussion on television that liberals were trying to sneak on the jury to undermine the outcome in the election. And as a result, she was getting threats from people and said, I don't think I can serve. Imagine you're called for jury duty. That's hard enough. You show up to do your duty, and now you're receiving death threats. The grand jury members whose names were disclosed in Georgia, who returned the indictment there against Donald Trump, all received death threats and harassment. That is not okay. And I think when we have leaders talking about words of violence, vengeance, bloodbath, and some of these kinds of words, it gives license to other people to engage in violence as well. And so, we had a man, after the search at Mar-a-Lago, a man who attacked an FBI office and got killed in a standoff with police. And he posted online that patriots need to go after the FBI because they planted evidence at Mar-a-Lago based on things that Donald Trump had said. There's a phrase in terrorism that I learned called stochastic terrorism, and it means random. I don't necessarily know who or when or where someone will attack based on my words, but I know that if I incite others, somebody will take that bait. Maybe there's someone out there who is unhinged, who will hear these fighting words and will take it up. It's not a crime to engage in this fiery rhetoric, but I think it is reckless. And I think that level of discourse is what is normalizing violence, and we are going to feel the wrath of that, and to some extent we have already.
So we're going to start to transition here. I have so many more questions, you have no idea, so I'm going to try to get other leagues to bring her back. But I know that it's about time for Q&A, so that's going to get set up, and if you're thinking you want to have a question, you can make your way over here. But we talked a little bit about the supply side, some of the regulations for disinformation and social media, but you also, in your book, talk about the demand side, what we can do. So can you talk a little bit about what we can do about disinformation?
Yes, I am, there's a lot of doom and gloom in my book, but I am pleased to say that the longest chapter is the one on solutions. So a lot of proposed solutions. And, from the demand side, as the consumers of information, what can we do to build resilience against disinformation so that we can spot it? And I think one of the things we can do is to improve our own media literacy, learning about some of these tactics. In Finland, they've introduced this into their schools because they have been bombarded with disinformation from their neighbor, Russia, for decades. And so they teach kids about looking for a second source, right? If only I had done that with Patrick Mahomes. I would have found it's not out there anywhere besides Spot Central. And I would have saved myself some embarrassment. So looking for a second source is really important, right? Not getting all your news from the same source. If all you do is watch Fox News or MSNBC, you may be missing important stories. I've actually begun following the BBC online, and it's really interesting. Guess what? We're not the only country in the world. Who knew? There's actually a lot of other news going on out there. Or they have interesting takes on what's going on in the United States. Sometimes they can look at it a little more objectively. There's a phrase, you can't see the picture when you're inside the frame, right? And so sometimes getting an outsider's perspective can be useful. Reading not just the headline, but also the story, because sometimes the headline is there to generate clicks and not to reflect accurately what's in the story. Understanding the difference between causation and correlation, which are two different things. Looking at data sets, is there some study that concluded that, something is good or bad for your health? Was the data set, 2 million people, or was it 2? Because that can make a difference in the reliability of it. So I think there are things we can do to build our media literacy. I also think we can do a better job with our own civics education. it has really declined in American society. I don't know about you, but when I was in school, civics was a required course in high school, and I learned about the 3 branches of government and checks and balances and all of those things that I think are really important to understanding and make it harder for us to be fooled by false claims when we understand how our government works. And yet I have read that today we spend 5 cents on civics education for every $50 we spend on STEM education in our public schools. Now, STEM education is important, and perhaps, there's more equipment that's necessary in STEM education, but 5 cents, come on, we can do better than that. There are some people filling the gaps, though. I learned yesterday, I was at the City Club in Cleveland, great place, and I met someone who's the executive director of the Cuyahoga Bar Association, and they have programs they take to schools to teach 11th graders in a one-day program about some basic civics. So, I'd love a semester or a year, but I'll take a day if that's what it takes.
They do that too. I just want you to know.
League of Women Voters? Yeah, well, and the League of Women Voters is another great resource that is providing education about voting and civics and issues, which is wonderful. But I think the last thing I'll suggest is we do also have to look inside ourselves and ask ourselves some critical questions. I mean, when was the last time you had considered your position on these hot button issues, whether it's guns, abortion, gay rights, immigration? And is there not room for compromise to reach some meaningful solutions on those areas? And isn't it more important that we move toward a more perfect union than that our side win? And so I ask you to, in your own daily discourse and as you're discussing these issues with your friends and neighbors, to make sure that you are choosing truth over tribe.
Thank you. So I think Shelley's going to lead by example, as she always does. First question to Shelley. Please, others, come up.
Actually, I'm just here to set the rules.
Oh, good.
I'm lead mom, and my role is lead mom. We want to take this opportunity for all of you to sort of line up. No, I have folks already. We just ask you to be succinct with your questions and respectful.
And not a long statement before the question,
Yes,
so we can get more questions. Great.
that's exactly right. So I'm going to turn it over. And thank you both. I could have listened to you all day, but I also want to hear the questions from my members. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm so excited you're here. I can't even just contain it. All right. So one of my questions, and I read your book. I actually did a little coffee clutch in my house over it because it's so great. But you named so many different things we can do that are not things we can do like today. Maybe we could do them next year. You know what I'm saying? There's so much to do. But one of my questions is about domestic terrorism. Because there's no law against domestic terrorism. International terrorism, yes. And I didn't know this until I called the FBI and I said, aren't you going to arrest Donald Trump for domestic terrorism? I got such a response, but there's no law.
Yeah.
So you can tell us about that?
Yes. I, as a former national security prosecutor, I think this is a real flaw in our federal criminal code, but there's a reason for it, and that is a reluctance to criminalize things that could intersect with our civil liberties. The worry is investigations might look like they are predicated on political views or on free speech or on free assembly. The FBI in the 1960s and 70s engaged in a lot of misconduct that makes people still to this day very suspicious of them. There have been protocols put in place, I think, to prevent some of those kinds of misconduct today, but the COINTEL program did use disinformation and other tactics to disrupt war protesters, civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King, using illegal wiretaps and other kinds of things. So I think that's the fear, that you can label any, your political rival as domestic terrorists and then use all kinds of tactics against them to disrupt their work. But I think that there's a way to get around that concern by using a crime that is parallel to the International Terrorism Statute. It says it is a crime to engage in acts of violence dangerous to human life. So that's the real important part of it, to advance a political agenda, essentially. And the international terrorism requires that there be some activity across national boundaries. So if you have Al-Qaeda or ISIS or another terrorist organization that is engaging in plans to use violence that's dangerous to human life, that can be a prosecutable crime. But if you have a group within the United States who is similarly planning to use violence to advance their own political agenda, there is no specific crime for that. Now, sometimes you can use a substitute. Like if they commit murders, you can charge murder. If they actually go through with an attack, you might be able to find some charge of assault. In the case of January 6th, there are some people charged with seditious conspiracy because they were actually trying to stop the peaceful transfer of presidential power. But there's nothing really that prevents someone from, say, engaging in a mass shooting at a meeting of the League of Women Voters because they want to advance some particular agenda. You know, again, you can charge them with a state crime, but to me, the value of having a federal offense is you must have a federal offense in place before federal agents can investigate it. And so the FBI is fond of using the term left of boom. This is a concept I teach to my students about crimes of conspiracy and attempt and solicitation. The goal is to stop the crime before it happens. Like I can charge murder, but then we got dead people. I'd rather stop the crime before we get to the murder. And so how do you do that? You do that by investigating, by using informants, by using wiretaps and other investigative techniques, but you can only begin an investigation if there is a crime to charge. With no crime on the books, it means it's why the FBI was really powerless before January 6th to investigate all those groups. You know, how people said, how could the FBI have been caught by surprise by what, like all of us knew that there was going to be a wild gathering on January 6th, and yet somehow the government seemed surprised by it. And it is because of this reluctance to investigate groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and others. And I think if we had a domestic terrorism statute on the books that included that violent conduct, dangerous to human life element, I think it would not run afoul of any of those civil liberties concerns, and I think it would enable law enforcement to stop those crimes occurring from left of boom. Just to explain what left of boom means, like if you think of a timeline, boom is the moment on the timeline when the attack occurs, so left means earlier on the timeline, and so we want to stop it somewhere left earlier before the attack actually happens. So I would advocate in favor of a domestic terrorism statute. I think it's one that's politically fraught, which is why we haven't had success with it so far.
Thank you so much.
Can I just say one more thing?
No, you can get back in line. I'm gonna.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm having a little fangirl moment because I listen to your podcast, Sisters-in-Law, and it's always very interesting. So my question for you is this. You know, when we're facing disinformation, misinformation, stuff that's coming from left, right, center, and it's all panic-inducing.
Yes.
What is your personal strategy to keep yourself from getting cynical and disengaging? Because that's where I find myself in a moment of existential dread, just saying, no more news.
Sure, and I think many people get to that point. I do think there's value in turning it off once in a while. Like, I don't think our whole lives should be spent consuming news. I think we should engage with real people. I think we should have lunch together. I think you should spend time in nature, do all the things that you love to do. But I also think it's really important that we do stay informed. And I agree with you. You hear all of this, and you know it is designed in many cases deliberately to get you ramped up, right? I mean, you ever watch the 6 o'clock news? There's something in your kitchen that may be killing you. More after these messages. You know, what is it? You know, because it keeps you tuned in and you're all scared, right? I mean, fear is a powerful motivator, and people know that. They prey upon it. But I think we have to, engage in self-care and make sure that we're spending some time away from all of these things to recharge. But I think we have to remember how important it is that we hold on to our democracy, and the way we do that is by being engaged and by doing the hard work of finding out accurate information. And there are great resources to do that, right? League of Women Voters is a fantastic resource. Our Secretary of State websites are a great resource about, information about voting. And so looking for those things, I think, is really important. So, keep fighting the fight. And I will tell you another thing that has been really encouraging to me is traveling around and meeting so many people who are really engaged and really informed and want to be part of the solution and understand that democracy is not a spectator sport. So thank you.
Thank you.
So, and I'm just going to jump in and say, that's why I always say I feel like I win the lottery, because I get to drive around Ohio talking to voters about democracy, and it feels awesome. I challenge everyone, when you feel overwhelmed with the stress of where we are, to find your sphere of influence. What is the thing you can do? We actually all have things we can do, right? I say that going and doing a voter registration drive for me is kind of like when your house is a mess, but at least you ran the vacuum, you got a thing done. For me, as voter registration, like I'm just, I do a lot of hard stuff in elections policy, right? But when I get to go meet new, kids who just turned 18, get them registered to vote and get them excited and tell them how to research their ballot, that feels good to me. It gives me hope, but it also is making a difference. So find your sphere of influence, find the place that you can make a difference.
Regarding citizenship classes, which you see how many people in here have gray hair. We all had them, and we know some of our children and grandchildren did not, nieces and nephews. But having given it very serious thought since Vietnam War days, and I would like your comment on this, I'm starting to think that is not the answer. It is a tiny piece of it. Here's why. I think in high school, when we had those, it was a little late. I think in elementary school, at home, you need to learn non-hierarchical, non-autocratic methods where you could debate and discuss. Sure, maybe mom and dad have veto power, but I do think elementary school kids, I think middle school kids, high school kids, I think they should, you understand what I'm saying, a whole revolution of how we work with each other. Because if church is being hierarchical and mom and dad are being autocrats, then all of a sudden when they're 16, 17, 18, you say, speak up, think about it, learn to discuss politely with other people. Really? That worries me. And you can see, like, I'm almost crying. And I wonder what you think about the whole society.
Yeah, that might be above my pay grade. But I do think conflict resolution is an important thing to be teaching to young children. I think maybe nobody is too young for conflict resolution, right? And because I think that sometimes we think that debate has to be a mean-spirited or browbeating. I did a little radio interview today on an issue where someone was had an opposing viewpoint, and we spoke to each other with, we're friends, with civility. And the host was so surprised that we were able to discuss this without being like, wow, look at that. They were able to discuss an issue without being angry at each other. I think that maybe we've lost that, right? Because we see so much now that is modeled on the shrill voices of cable television, where the loudest voice is the one that gets noticed. And instead, the most effective way, I think, to resolve disputes is by showing respect and asking questions and discussing what's the evidence to support a conclusion. I had a chance to see that when I talked about this in my book, a trip to Ireland, where I happened to be there when they were voting on a constitutional amendment to permit abortion, which had previously been illegal. And it passed by overwhelming margin. But we were traveling there, and it just happened to be there. I thought, I wonder if we should go. Like, will there be civil unrest? Will there be, rioting in the streets? Maybe this is not a safe time to be there. And it was just the opposite. Everyone was so lovely. On every street corner, there were people standing with their pamphlets, some on the yay side and some on the nay side. And they would, just sort of ask if you would be interested in hearing more about the issue. And I said yes and engaged with them because I was just curious to hear more about it. And as politely as possible, sharing that with me, asking if I had questions, rather than telling me what to think, just offering to be a resource. And they were, it was such a much more effective way. They might be on opposite street corners, and they're just waving to each other. No one is browbeating or yelling at each other. And I thought, what a great example and model of how we engage in public discourse. I mean, that really is the way it should be, right? Reasonable, logical arguments designed to come to a best solution for society. We might disagree at the end, but if we feel like we had our say and a decision was made, I think we're more likely to buy into it than if, we feel like our enemy just got their way. So thank you for that.
All right, my boss is telling me it's about time to be done, but we're going to take two more questions. One more question? One more. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for taking my question. And Barbara, I was in Dublin on Gay Pride Parade Day. Every public building, every restaurant, every store was decorated
Nice.
for it. When my husband and I decided maybe we should move to Dublin. Anyway, on a different subject, having to do with free speech and looking at what's going on the college campuses right now. And as a Jewish person myself, with two great nieces graduating from colleges, hopefully in a couple of weeks, that hopefully we'll have graduation, because none of them had graduation during COVID in this particular class. Where does it end, Barbara? Where do their rights to free speech clash with the horrible anti-Semitic signs, things that are being said? Is it free speech to hold up a sign that says all Jews are roaches? Where can it end? And is it also being fueled by all the media coverage?
Yeah, it's such a fraught moment in time. I know at my own campus at the University of Michigan, we have an encampment on our central diag. So far peaceful, but protesting and demanding meetings with the regents of the university to divest from companies that invest in Israel. But I think there are two different bodies of rules to think about. There are criminal laws, and then there are also student codes, the rules of a school. And so criminally, it's very difficult to criminalize speech, as ugly as it may be. So the example you just gave is not a violation of the law, ugly as it may be. I think when we cross a criminal line, it's when there's an actual threat communicated to a particular student. So I think if a particular student is threatened, that can be a crime. I think property damage is a crime. What we saw at Columbia the other day, where they broke in and occupied a building, that's, trespassing, burglary, breaking and entering, crimes. And those people, I think, were properly removed from that location. And then the other body of law rules is campus rules. I mean, a campus has a duty to protect its students. It has a duty to educate its students. It has a business function, like we got to have classes. We can't have disruption of classes. So I think even though these aren't crimes where a person could be charged with a crime and sent to jail, you can't say we will suspend or expel you if you fail to comply with our rules. And on many campuses, those rules include things like intimidating or harassing other students, right? I mean, you're in the classroom, we want to have academic freedom where perhaps we discuss ideas like immigration or affirmative action, which can be very fraught for students, or, LGBTQ rights. Those are very fraught for students, and we ask that students discuss those issues respectfully. But when there are outright threats or intimidation on campus, which, for example, the one you said, I think universities are well within their rights to say, you are creating an intimidating atmosphere for some of our students. We have a duty to protect them. And so you are going to be, suspended or expelled or whatever else, other penalties administratively that we have. So I think we need to think about it in those two ways. And sometimes I think people conflate both those two things. Like, it's not a crime to say, bad things about people, no, but it can be a violation of a student code of conduct. I think also people really conflate where they stand on the issue with the conduct. And so, the issue of what's happening in Gaza and Israel is very complicated, and there are, diplomats trying to resolve what's happening in those places, and the loss of life for everybody is awful. But aside from that, students may have strong feelings on either side of those issues, and they are entitled to express them. But when they are interfering with safety, health, businesses, property, or the ability of other students to obtain their education, then that conduct is run afoul of the rules, and there should be sanctions.
Thank you. I think it's actually an interesting place to end, and I know it's 1:00, but what we've talked about here is really how disinformation has allowed us to demonize each other, to oversimplified issues, and even among campuses, like what is going on in the campuses, it's easy to paint with a broad swath what's going on, and there's wide ranges of differences, right, in terms of what's happening on the campuses. So I'd love for you to talk to us about this concept of, you have a concept of tolerance, right? That democratic norms and tolerance. And maybe that's one of the things we all need to do, is we all need to actually try to look at each other with empathy, not as the other, even if they disagree with us or they're of a different identity than us. And could you just maybe end with something then?
Yeah, tolerance is really interesting. When I was in law school, a professor of mine had written a book called The Tolerant Society, urging people to be tolerant across difference and race. And I remember at the time thinking, like, tolerance, what a low bar, right? Shouldn't we just, be kind to each other, celebrate each other, embrace each other? But now, I'll take tolerance. Because, as you say, we have been exploited with disinformation to demonize and scapegoat people as other. And I think that American society, we are a pluralistic society we got to live together. If we're going to solve our problems, we need to do it through compromise. We can't have winners and losers. It just doesn't work that way. There's a great book that I cite in my book called How Democracies Die by Daniel Lipitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. And they are political scientists. And one of the things they talk about is they look at the ways that democracies that have failed, and they look at the way other democracies have thrived. And they say that the key hallmarks of successful democracies are tolerance and political forbearance. So tolerance is, look, I don't agree with everything you say, but I understand you have a right to say it. We all have the different views and we can express them, and we'll try to reach a consensus so we can move our society forward as best we can, right? I see that as tolerance. But political forbearance is also that when people have power in government, that just because they can use power doesn't mean they always should. And so, for example, I think about the Supreme Court right now. They've got the votes. Just because they can make certain decisions doesn't mean they should, throw out precedent and the ways they ordinarily decide cases. And so, I would call for our political leaders to make sure they understand that they represent the whole country as well, and not just their winning team, because if they're winning, it means a lot of other people are losing.
Ken, thank you.
Thank you so much. So we will leave our two guests with some gifts that are uniquely Gianca. So I want to thank everyone here. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. And of course, thank you to our guests.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, we've already just added I'd sign it. We are going to, I'm sorry, excuse me, I get closer. We have a small number of books that are still available for sale. So if you would like to purchase a book, you can do that out in the